many Zionist thinkers believe, is going to be about building up the country spiritually. Israel is thriving now. It's no longer a pioneering nation that's trying to settle and build the land. But there's so much to be done in the society to build it up spiritually, as we'll see. Before we launch into the PowerPoint, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, to say that I'm going to be sharing with you for around an hour. And if during that time you have clarifying questions, if something isn't clear, please write it in the chat box on the side of your screen. And Harvey will unmute himself and share the questions with me. And at the end of the presentation, we'll have time to discuss together. The other thing I wanted to say is that it's been argued that there are really only two topics, religion and politics. Today, we're going to be looking at religion in Israel. I know Israeli politics are on many folks' minds these days with everything that's going on with the possible annexation of the Jewish parts of the West Bank, but we're not getting into that today. We're going to stick to religion. And there are many opportunities to learn about what's going on in Israel politically. There are very few opportunities to explore what we're going to be exploring today. So I want to give it our complete focus. Okay, now I'm going to begin the PowerPoint. Okay. So an important Jewish value is vehave dan et kol ha'adam lekaf zchut, that you should judge everyone favorably. In other words, try to give them the benefit of the doubt until proven otherwise. And that's something that I hope we'll do today. I would invite you now to put aside any baggage that you have about any religious or secular groups in Israeli society. And for the next hour, listen to them. We're going to have a chance to hear how they understand themselves and understand their role in Israel. And as a psychotherapist, I really believe that we have to listen and understand before we can come to any conclusions. Now, for many folks, it seems redundant to talk about the renewal of Judaism in Israel. They wonder, how can you have a Jewish state without Judaism being at its center? And that's a very good question. But the reality is that for around the first half century of Israel's existence, it identified as a secular Jewish nation state. And it's really only been in the last 20 years that Judaism has come back to the center. I can remember having a conversation with my dad in 1988 when I was 8 years old, and him telling me, you know, not everybody in Israel cares as much about observing Judaism as we do at Adath Shalom. And I said, what? You've got to be kidding. Then what's the point of having a Jewish state? And it was a good question. It was a question that a lot of Israelis started to ask right around that time. 40 is a very significant number in Judaism. And at the point where my father and I were having our conversation, Israel was about to celebrate its 40th birthday. David Ben-Gurion said famously in 1948 that it would take about 40 years for the Dor HaMidbar, the generation of the wilderness, to pass away. And by that he meant, he borrowed the term from the Torah, talking about the Jews who left slavery and went into the desert and had to die in the desert before we could enter the land of Israel. But he was specifically referring to all of the Jews who had just made Aliyah to Israel, Holocaust survivors, Mizrahim from the Arab world. He felt it would take 40 years for the shackles of the diaspora to be thrown off and for a new generation of Ivriim, Hebrews, not Jews, he specifically called them Hebrews, to come to the fore, and they would be a new kind of Jew who were self-reliant, ingenuous, socialized to democracy, and who would let go of traditional Judaism, which was strongly and not without some reason associated with a sense of passivity. He wanted the Jewish people to be able to claim their own destiny. Now, the Warsaw Ghetto Monument, which we find at Yad Vashem and also in Warsaw itself, speaks eloquently to this idea about the diaspora and Judaism. On the front, we see Mordechai Analevitz, the commander of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and his brave fighters. But look at what's on the back. You see traditional Jews. You see a rabbi with a long beard. You see women who have their heads covered, as Orthodox women traditionally do. And they are bent over like the proverbial sheep going to the slaughter. And you see Nazis in their pith helmets at the back marching them along. This was the way that the diaspora and that traditional Judaism was viewed. It was viewed as a failure in modernity because it encouraged passivity and over-reliance on salvation from God. And Ben-Gurion wasn't wrong about the need for Israelis to claim a sense of self-reliancy, but the tragedy was throwing out the baby with the bathwater, was distancing the new state from the riches of Judaism, which had sustained the Jewish people for 4,000 years. Ben-Gurion was right about the first three things that he talked about. Israel is today a strong democracy, even if it can't get a government together for an entire year. It has tremendous ingenuity. Its economy and its culture are flourishing. And it's completely self-reliant. Where Ben-Gurion was very wrong was about the role that Judaism would play in the state. These are some statistics from a study that we're going to look at a fair bit today, the most comprehensive study ever made about how Jews are doing Judaism in Israel. And we see here that 87% of the population considers it very important to be Jewish. And by this, the authors of the study were not looking to see people's identification to the Jewish nation. They were talking about Judaism itself. 78% believe in God. 76% believe Jews should care for each other wherever they are. 57% light candles on Shabbat. 64% have a kosher home. When I first went to Israel almost 25 years ago in 1996, I was excited to hear about the nascent spiritual renewal that was going on in the country. And I followed it closely when I got back to Canada. And when I finally moved to Israel in 2009, a highlight of my time there was to see it going on all around me, to meet secular Jews who in midlife started studying Jewish texts and knew that this was something they wanted at the core of their life. Even if to this day they don't keep kosher or go to shul, they love Judaism. I met religious Israelis who were rediscovering what it could mean to be a religious Israeli, how it could be more inclusive, how it could be more creative. I even met ultra-orthodox Israelis who were expanding their definition of Judaism.
Ari, we have a clarifying question.
Go right ahead.
When was this survey done?
I'm about to get to that. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was very happy last year when the book #Israeli Judaism came out. This book is a summation of the most comprehensive study ever made of how Israelis are doing Judaism. It was carried out in 2018 by JPPI, the Jewish People's Policy Institute, which is a nonpartisan think tank in Jerusalem that seeks to do scientific data collection about the Jewish people and report on it. They commissioned one of Israel's leading demographers, Professor Camille Fuchs, who you see in the photo on the left, on the bottom, and he created an internet survey which had 3,000 respondents from across the Jewish spectrum, from the ultra-orthodox to the most secular Israeli. They were asked 300 questions. And what made this survey especially meaningful for me was that they weren't just asking about beliefs. They were mainly focusing on actions. What do you do every day? Do you light Shabbat candles? Do you learn Torah? Do you recite brachot? And this is a very Jewish way to study Judaism, because traditionally we believe that a person is to be judged on their ma'asim, is to be judged on their actions, not specifically on their beliefs. And that when at the age of 120, you die and go to the next world, the Talmud says the questions that you'll be asked on arrival are about your actions in your life, your ethical actions, not your beliefs. It's a fascinating book. It's very readable. Fuchs teamed up with Shmuel Rosner, who's one of Israel's leading journalists and who writes in both English and Hebrew. He used to write for the Jerusalem Post. And on one foot, what their study tells us is, as Rosner writes, there's a new Jew and she lives in Israel. She practices Judaism like no Judaism before it and no Judaism anywhere else. It's a Judaism unique to a place and to a time, an amalgamation of tradition and nationality. It's unlike anything else because there hasn't been a Jewish state for 2,000 years, and there has never been a Jewish democracy. So in some ways, it's a revolution. But I also question whether it's only a revolution. I think in many ways, it's also a renewal. It's a renewal in that Torah and Halakha are about a society. We haven't had a Jewish state. We haven't had a fully Jewish society for 2,000 years. So in some ways, we're coming back to our origins. There's the expression that we all know, Kol Yisrael Aruvim Ze Lezeh, all Israel is responsible for one another. To be a Jew is to live in social relationships with other people and care for each other. And the quote on the left is, Hafoch ba v'hafoch ba dekula ba, turn it over and turn it over because everything is in it, which is from Pirkei Avot. When you look at the Torah itself and at the Talmud and at the halachic codes, what you see is a blueprint for a whole society. It doesn't just cover belief, it doesn't just cover davening and kashrut. The Talmud covers how to set up a government. It covers taxation. It covers the redistribution of wealth to allow for more social equality. It goes from A to Z. And so Judaism, like its sister religion Islam, but unlike Christianity, is a religion of laws. It's a blueprint for a society. And it's only in a social context that Judaism, I believe, can come to its full flourishing. We say traditionally in the Shema twice a day, Udibarta bam b'shivtecha b'veitecha u'belechtecha b'derech u'b'shochbecha u'bekumecha. You should speak of the Torah when you're at home, when you go out on your way, when you lie down, and when you get up. Those of us who live in the diaspora can be thinking about Torah, thinking about how it can relate to and guide our lives in the 21st century. When we're at home, when we're in our personal homes, when we're in our spiritual homes, in our communities. But when it comes to Belektecha B'derech, it's a lot harder for us here. Of course, our actions on a daily basis can be guided by Torah, but for most of us, unless we're Jewish professionals, you can't sit down for coffee during a break at work and bring Torah into a conversation that you're having, or if you do, you have to translate and explain a lot. And that's something that I really miss about Israel. You can be, I could be at a coffee shop talking to the person sitting next to me, and if the moment allowed for it, whip out a line from the Talmud that I had been studying that fit the discussion. Friends tell me that when they sit down at a high-tech company that they work at, and the company is wrestling with an ethical decision that they need to resolve, if it's appropriate, if it's helpful, they can pull out a line from Jewish ethics or from the Parshat HaShavua and share it with people. And whether their colleagues are religious or secular, it will usually be appreciated and often taken to heart, and it can affect the conversation. So there's a Jewish conversation going on all the time in Israel, in all parts of the spectrum. You see it in the Hebrew language media, even in the most secular papers. And it's something that makes Judaism so vibrant in Israel that it's playing a role in people's lives on a daily basis. So how are Israelis doing Judaism? Well, when Camille Fuchs aggregated the data from his study, he came up with 4 categories. On the bottom left, we have the universalists. These are people who neither strongly identify with the state of Israel or with Judaism. If they identify as anything, it's as citizens of the world. Next, on the bottom right, we have the Israelis. The Israelis are leftovers of the old labor Zionist secular Jewish nationalism. They are strongly identified with the state of Israel, but not identified with Judaism. They tend to be Ashkenazi, they tend to be middle-aged or older, and both they and the Universalists are populations that are in rapid decline. Next, on the top right, we have the majority group, what Fuchs calls the Jew-Raelis. Jew-Raelis are Israeli Jews who both identify with Judaism and identify with the state of Israel. And he sums up their outlook on one foot, saying a good Jew or a good Jew-Raeli serves in the IDF and observes Shabbat and festivals. Because they are such a large group, over almost 4 million people out of the 6.5 million Israelis, 6.5 million Jewish Israelis, they are a very diverse group, as we'll see, ranging from people whose lifestyle is very secular, but who love Judaism in their own way, to people who are devoutly Orthodox and Zionists. On the upper left, we have the Jews. This refers exclusively to ultra-Orthodox Jews who are strongly identified with Judaism, but not very strongly identified with the state of Israel. Now, I want to be clear, the fact that Universalists and the Jews are not strongly identified with the state of Israel does not mean that they are actively working against the state of Israel. It's only a small fringe of Universalists who are pro-BDS and working against Israel, and it's only a small fringe of Haredim, ultra-Orthodox Jews, who are anti-Zionist. Okay, so 4 other attributes that we see from the study are that Israeli Jews tend to have a high level of confidence in Judaism. It's something positive that they see as a constant in their lives. They attribute a great deal of importance to their Jewishness, as we saw. They have a nationalist interpretation of Jewishness, which means that for Jew-Raelis, it's very hard to draw a line between where their nationalism ends and their Judaism begins. The two are fused together. Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, is, for example, for many Jew-Raelis, both a religious and a nationalistic holiday. And finally, they have a pretty good level of Jewish literacy and practice. Even secular Jewralis have a much higher level of Jewish literacy than do secular Jews in North America. I would also add that Israeli Judaism is relaxed and it's accessible. It's relaxed because as an Israeli, you don't have to worry about Jewish continuity. You don't have to worry about your kids remaining Jewish. If they stay in Israel, they're going to be Jewish in all likelihood. And that's a huge relief. That frees people up from the insecurity that so many diaspora Jews have, that impedes them from being more creative, from pushing the boundaries more. And it's also accessible because Judaism is all around you and you just have to plug into it. I took the JPPI survey myself. You see my results on the right as against the results of different communities in Israel. I'm the blue dot at the top there. We see that Mizrahi Jews, which means Sephardi Jews whose families settled in North Africa and Arabia, and the Jews of Arabia and Persia, Mizrahim are the most traditional Jews in Israel, and they're also the most nationalistic. The Jewish-Israeli average, which you see in yellow, shows us that Israeli Jews tend to be fairly nationalistic, right of center, and they tend to be fairly traditional. And you see the relaxed and accessible part on the upper left-hand side. It's a family enjoying a seder. They're not wearing kippot, except for the guy at the back. They're very relaxed. They're wearing shorts and t-shirts, sitting outside, enjoying the land of Israel, and connecting to the seder in a way that's meaningful to them. When it comes to Judaism being accessible, I wanted to share these screenshots. These are all taken from Yediot Achronot, Israel's largest mass circulation daily, which caters to a largely secular audience. On the right was an internet poll from Pesach this year, which asks, how do you like your matzah? Do you like it flavored or do you like it dry? And people were polled. On the upper left is a screenshot of Daka Mi HaParsha. It's a column about the Parshat Shavua, but you notice that the writer isn't wearing a kippah. He is not observant, but he is an insightful commentator on Torah, one of many Israeli secular Jews who have fallen in love with Torah. And on the bottom is an ad for Simchat Torah in the port of Yafo. It's not advertised in a Jewish section of the paper, it's advertised in a social section of the paper, because this is a place that many people want to be on Simchat Torah. There's an expression in our tradition, Yeridat Hadorot, the idea that every generation since Sinai has gotten farther away from Kedusha, from holiness. That Israel shows us that there's really an Aliyat Hadorot going on, that each successive generation becomes more attached to tradition. You see on the right how the younger Israelis are, the more attached to tradition they are. Middle-aged and young Israelis are a lot more traditional than Israelis in their 50s and in their 60s. So how did this happen? How did Judaism make such a comeback in Israel? Well, one factor is what my beloved teacher, Yossi Klein Halevi, wrote. Yossi is one of Israel's leading English language journalists and one of the best commentators on religious renewal in Israel. And Yossi writes, we've lost our secular religion, which was labor Zionism. And we live in a society that's under relentless existential pressure, where we are constantly thinking about death. That's the fertile ground for Israel's spiritual awakening. So Israelis are not what I would call a moribund people. I find them actually very life-affirming. But the specter of death is definitely something people have had to contend with through Israel's wars, through the Second Intifada in particular. And there are two other factors I want to point out. On the upper left-hand corner, you see modern Tel Aviv, a bustling, high-tech hub that's been called the Silicon Wadi. Israel is not a socialist collectivist state anymore. It has become more individualistic, more consumeristic. And that's meant that given the existential pressures that Israelis face and the fact that there isn't as strong a sense of all-encompassing purpose, Israelis are looking for meaning, they're looking for connection, they're looking for community. And many people have found that in Judaism. And on the bottom left, we have a picture of a Hachnasat Sefer Torah in the Sephardi community. The Sephardim also deserve a lot of credit, and the Mizrahim, for the comeback of Judaism in Israel. They never really left. They were Shomrei Emunim, keepers of the faith. When they made Aliyah in the 1950s, they did not drink the labor Zionist Kool-Aid about secular Jewish nationalism. They kept going to shul and observing Shabbat and Chagim. And another thing that I really admire about Sfaradim is that they have a strong idea of Yehudi afal pi shechote Yehudi. The notion that even if a Jew sins, he or she is still a Jew. In other words, whether you're fully observant, whether you're not fully observant, you're welcome in many Sephardi communities. And many Sephardim, even if they drive on Shabbat or check their smartphones, will still enjoy very much going to shul and being traditional. They have this kind of relaxed traditionalism that many non-Mizrahi Israelis have now taken on. We also have to understand that the Israeli population has expanded tenfold. Now, this graph is actually the total Israeli population, Jewish and non-Jewish citizens. There are now 9 million citizens of Israel, and 6.5 million of them are Jewish. But that's also a tenfold increase. There were only 600,000 Jews in 1948. Today, there are 6.5 million. This population explosion has meant that Israel has expanded and become a lot more diverse. Now, whatever your hashkafa, whatever your religious outlook, you can find an affinity group, you can find a community to be part of. And I think it's been very healthy for Israel that it's no longer a small country with all-encompassing ideology, but that it's embraced its diversity. But that's also led to conflict. And when we look at the way religion in Israel is covered in the media, what we often see is the conflict. And if you ask some Israelis, they will say that the country is coming apart, that there is a lack of common ground. But the data shows otherwise. There is conflict between religious and secular Israelis, some of it quite toxic. But Israelis have more in common now than they ever did in the past. There were great divisions between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jews. Those are disappearing now. Over 50% of Israelis no longer define themselves as Sephardi, Ashkenazi, or Mizrahi. They define themselves as Israeli. They may have parents who come from both groups. And that's been a major thing to bring people together. The other is that walls between communities have come down in the information age. There's more convergence. We'll see how this is even happening in the ultra-orthodox community. And people are collaborating more and learning from each other more. In a small country, it couldn't be otherwise. Everyone is watching each other and, whether they know it or not, being influenced by each other. And as we saw, 87% of the population highly values Judaism. And you may wonder, if so many Israelis highly value Judaism, why can't they just get along? But the point is that they value Judaism, but they have very different approaches to it. And when you love something passionately, you're going to argue with people who do it differently. We only argue about things we truly care about. But underneath it all is a shared commitment to Judaism. Okay, now we're going to meet some real-life Israelis that I've had the privilege of getting to know from these different groups. I'd like you to meet my teacher, David Senesh. You've probably heard of his aunt, Chana Senesh, the great Zionist hero and martyr and poet. Chana wrote in her diary in 1940, "I've become a Zionist. To me, it means that I now consciously and strongly feel a Jew and am proud of it. One needs something to believe, something for which one has wholehearted enthusiasm. One needs to feel that one's life has meaning, that one is needed in this world. Zionism fulfills this for me." And for David, Chana's words have always been a touchstone. As one of Israel's leading psychologists, he deeply believes that people need a sense of meaning in order to live and in order to heal from trauma. He's a leading world expert in trauma and a survivor of trauma himself. Like his aunt, he was a POW at one point. And for him, the labor Zionism that he grew up with was all about living with purpose. It really taught him, as it were, to ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And for the last 40 years, David has been working to improve the mental health infrastructure in Israel, which needed a lot of work. And Zionism alone has always done it for him. He's an atheist. He is not particularly identified with Judaism. But David wonders what it's going to be like for his grandchildren. He loves Israel, even as he's a person of the left who has many strong criticisms of the government. He loves his country deeply, and he wants his grandchildren to live there. And he wonders, how are they going to find a sense of purpose now that Israeli society is so diverse, now that there's no longer this all-encompassing sense of mission to physically build the country and fulfill the labor Zionist vision. And a lot of Israelis have been asking the same question, and many of them have been finding some of their answer to it through involvement with Judaism. Let's look more closely at how Israelis identify. We've looked at the two groups that are totally secular, the Israelis and the Universalists. And now we come into the spectrum of Jew-Raelis, the majority group. That starts with people who are secular traditionalists. These are people who do not feel bound by halakha. Halakha is really the dividing line between religious and secular. A secular person may believe in God. They may love Shabbat and Chagim, but they don't follow the Shulchan Aruch, the authoritative code of halakha that you see on the right-hand side. They're much like Reform Jews. They choose what they find meaningful, and they don't feel mitzuveh, they don't feel commanded to do it. They do it because they choose to do it. Traditional Israelis, somewhat like Jews in the old conservative movement, accept the idea of halakha and rabbinic authority, but choose whether or not to observe particular mitzvot. But they, unlike the secular traditionalists, they often belong to shuls, and they have a more recognizably traditional lifestyle. Liberal religious Israelis, the community that I was part of when I lived in Israel, are fully halachically observant, but they're dedicated to a more makel, a more lenient approach to halakha, and with a goal of inclusiveness. Datiyim, or Dati Lumi, religious Zionists, are fiercely dedicated both to Judaism and to the state of Israel, and to a fairly mainstream approach to halakha. And then we have the Haredi community, which we'll get into later. Okay, so secular traditional Israelis are doing something very new and radical. They're perhaps the most radical group that we're going to see today, in that there has really never been an attempt to create a secular approach to Jewish living, with the exception of certain Jewish humanist groups in Poland. And Yossi Klein Halevi writes about how what needs to happen is the creation of an indigenous form of non-Orthodox Israeli Judaism. Israelis are trying to reclaim Judaism on their own terms. On the upper right-hand side is Yeshivat Binah. This is the first secular Israeli yeshiva. There are now several. And you see that it has some key things in common with other yeshivot. People are sitting around volumes of the Talmud, engrossed in learning. You see Sifrei Kodesh, you see Torah texts surrounding them on the bookshelves. But there are also some things that are very different from other yeshivot. It's co-ed. You notice nobody has a kippah on. Secular Israelis are very makpid, are very insistent on not wearing a kippah, which they associate with orthodoxy. And in addition to having Torah texts, there's also a modern Israeli secular book about the Talmud on the table. On the bottom, you see a secular sort of a chavurah in Petach Tikva celebrating Shabbat. And they're doing it in their very own way. They're not all facing towards Jerusalem, as you see in a traditional minyan. They're facing each other. There's music. Most of them are not wearing kippot. And they're davening in a place where they can really drink in the land of Israel, which is so important to their identity as secular Israelis. As we said, the two are fused together. And their davening will often involve some traditional tefillot, some meditation, maybe even Buddhist meditation, modern Israeli poetry and music that stirs the soul, and they've created their own blend. One of the most eloquent spokespeople for secular Israeli Judaism is Dr. Ruth Calderon. She was briefly a member of the Knesset for 2 years with Yesh Atid. And in her inaugural speech for the Knesset, she got up and taught Talmud and talked about the role of Jewish texts for the state of Israel. And one of the things she said was, in my Israeli education, I was not acquainted with the Mishnah, the Talmud, Kabbalah, or Hasidism. I've heard this from many people of her generation. The new Hebrew created by educators from the country's founding generation realized their dream and became a courageous, practical, and suntanned soldier. But for me, I contained a void. But when I first encountered the Talmud and became completely enamored with its language, its humor, its profound thinking, its modes of discussion, and the practicality, humanity, and maturity that emerged from its lines, I sensed that I had found the love of my life, what I had been lacking. It's incredible that this very secular Jewish Jewreli was the first person to ever teach Talmud in the Knesset. The Knesset has many ultra-orthodox members. None of them ever got up to teach Torah. She was really making a powerful statement. And I'll send a link to the video of her entire speech later on. It's really worth watching, and it has subtitles. And Ruth was intimately involved with founding the first secular yeshiva, which we saw before, and other programs for secular Israelis.
אדוני יושב הראש, כנסת נכבדה. הספר הזה שבידיי שינה את חיי, והוא במידה רבה הסיבה שהגעתי ליום הזה וזכיתי לנאום בכנסת ישראל כחברת כנסת חדשה. אני משוכנעת שלימודי הספרים הגדולים של התרבות העברית והיהודית הכרחיים לבניית תרבות עברית חדשה בישראל. אי אפשר לצעוד אל העתיד בלי לדעת מאין באנו, מי אנחנו, לדעת באופן אינטימי, בפרטי פרטים, לדעת את הנשגב וגם את המקומם והנלעג. התורה אינה קניינו של זרם זה או אחר, היא המתנה שקיבלנו כולנו, ולכולנו ניתנה הזדמנות להתבונן בה כשאנחנו בוראים את מציאות חיינו. אף אחד לא לקח מאיתנו את התלמוד. ואת הספרות הרבנית. במו ידינו מסרנו אותו בימים בהם היה נראה כי יש משימה דחופה וחשובה יותר, לבנות מדינה, להקים צבא, חקלאות, תעשייה ועוד. עכשיו הגיע הזמן לחזור ולנחס לעצמנו מה ששלנו, להתענג על ההון התרבותי שמחכה לנו, לעינינו, לדמיוננו, ליצירתנו. במקום לספר על יופיו של הספר הזה, אני מבקשת לספר סיפור מן התלמוד, סיפור מיניאטורי אחד, המעשה ברב רחומי, כתובות ס"ב עמוד ב', ומתוכו לומר כמה דברים על הרגע הזה ועל המשימות שאציב לעצמי בכנסת. יום אחד, ושחתי שמעתה, הווה מסחיה דבית הוא, השתעתי, לאתה. חלש דעתה, אחי דמעתה מעינה, הווה יטיב ביגרה, הפחית איגרא מיתותי ונח נפשי. רב רחומי היה רב, קודם כל איש, הרבה איש, רב, רחומי בארמית זה אהבה. רחומי מהמילה רחם, מישהו שיודע להכיל, שיודע לקבל לגמרי, כמו שרחם של אישה יודע להכיל את התינוק. זו בחירה מאוד יפה למילה אהבה בארמית, כי אנחנו יודעים שביוונית לקחו את המילה רחם ובנו ממנו את המילה היסטריה. אז הבחירה הארמית לקחת מרחם את המילה אהבה היא בחירה פמיניסטית של חז"ל. הוא היה שכיח, הוא היה מצוי לפני רבא, ראש הישיבה של מחוזה. הוא היה מצוי, כלומר למד, התקבל ללימודים בישיבה הגדולה, אחת מ4 ישיבות האייבי ליג של בבל, נהרדע, מחוזה, פומפדיטה וסורה. הוא למד במחוזה, והוא למד לפני ראש הישיבה של מחוזה, שהוא היה כל כך מפורסם שקראו לו רבא. א' בסוף מילה בארמית זה הידיעה, הרב. והיה רגיל, אני רומזת לכם שחז"ל לא אוהבים אנשים שעושים דברים מתוך הרגל. בדרך כלל כשמישהו רגיל בתלמוד, תוך כמה שורות מישהו ימות. היה רגיל שהיה בא לביתו, ביתו בארמית זה אשתו. זה גם אשתו וגם ביתו. כלומר גבר שאין לו אישה הוא הומלס. אישה שאין לה גבר היא לא, אבל גבר בלי אישה חסר בית. היה רגיל שהיה בא לביתו כל ערב יום הכיפורים. אתם שמים לב כשהגמרא אומרת היה רגיל שהיה בא לביתו כל ערב יום הכיפורים, יש כאן מידה של אירוניה חז"לית. מה זאת אומרת כל פעם בשנה? זה לא כל כך הרבה. ואנחנו גם, אתם בטח חושבים לעצמכם איזה מין תאריך בן אדם בוחר לבוא לאשתו בערב יום הכיפורים, שהוא לא בדיוק יום של אינטימיות, אלא יום של תפילה, בדרך כלל אפילו לא בבית. יום אחד, פעם אחת, שנה אחת, משכה אותו השמועה. הלימוד בבית המדרש הקסים אותו כל כך שהוא שכח, הוא לא יצא בזמן, והוא לא יכול היה לעזוב את הלימודים ולא יצא הביתה. הייתה מצפה אשתו, אבל מסחיה דבית הוא. עכשיו הוא בא, עכשיו הוא בא. בארמית שומעים את הנשימה שלה, השתעתי. הציפייה הזאת שכל SMS וכל טלפון וכל צעדים בחוץ וכל נקישה בדלת, את בטוחה שזה הוא. עכשיו הוא בא, עכשיו הוא בא, לא בא. ברגע מסוים היא מבינה שהשנה הוא כבר לא יגיע. אולי יצא שופר של יום הכיפורים וכבר אף אחד לא ייכנס מפני קדושת החג. חלש דעתה. האישה הזאת שחיכתה כל השנה, שמחכה כבר שנים רבות כל השנה ליום אחד, לא יכולה לעמוד בזה יותר, ודעתה חולשת, היא מתאכזבת, היא עצובה, היא מאבדת את השליטה. אחית דמעתה מעינה, היא מוציאה דמעה אחת, היא מורידה, זה לשון פעיל, לא לשון סביל, היא נותנת לדמעה אחת לזלוג על הלחי מהעין, אחרי שנים שהיא לא בכתה. עכשיו אנחנו צריכים לדמיין לעצמנו מסך מפוצל, בצד אחד קלוז-אפ על דמות של אישה, על פנים של אישה, שדמעה אחת זולגת על לחיה, ובצד השני היה יושב על הגג במחוזה, יושב רב רחומי כולו לבוש לבן ומרגיש קדוש. אתם יודעים, אחרי יום של כמה שעות בלי אוכל אנחנו מרגישים נורא מורמים, והוא לומד תורה על הגג עם הכוכבים ומרגיש כל כך קרוב לשמיים. היה יושב על הגג, כשנופלת הדמעה מהעין של האישה, נפחת הגג מתחתיו, הוא נופל על הקרקע ונחה נפשו, בארמית ומת. מה אני יכולה ללמוד מרב רחומי ואשתו? אני לומדת שצדיקות היא לא דבקות בתורה על חשבון רגישות לאדם. אני לומדת שבמחלוקת יש לא פעם שני צדדים צודקים, ועד שלא אבין שגם אני וגם הצד השני, גם האישה וגם רב רחומי, מרגישים שהם עושים את הדבר הנכון והם אחראים לבית. הרבה פעמים אנחנו מרגישים האישה שמחכה והולכת לצבא ועושה את העבודה, והאחרים על הגג לומדים תורה, ופעמים האנשים האחרים מרגישים שהם נושאים את כל מסע המסורת והתרבות והתורה על גבם, ואנחנו הולכים לים ועושים חיים. גם אני וגם הצד השני מרגישים שעל כתפיהם כל האחריות לבית. עד שלא אבין את זה לא אראה את הבעיה נכוחה ולא אוכל למצוא פתרון. אני מזמינה את כולנו לשנים של עשייה מתוך מחשבה ומחלוקת מתוך הבנה וכבוד לאחר. אני שואפת להביא למצב בו לימוד התורה יהיה נחלת כל ישראל, בחינת תורה מונחת בקרן זווית, וכל מי שרוצה ליטול יבוא וייטול. שכל אזרחי ישראל הצעירים ייקחו חלק בנטל, גם בלימוד תורה וגם בשירות צבאי ואזרחי, וביחד ייבנה הבית ולא תחלש הדעת. אני מבקש לסיים בתפילה שכתב חברי חיים היימס, תפילה בכניסה לכנסת. יהי רצון מלפניך, אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו ואמותינו, שאצא מהבית הזה כפי שנכנסתי אליו, שלמה עם עצמי ועם הבריות. מי ייתן שמעשיי יהיו לטובת כל תושבי מדינת ישראל, ושאפעל לתקן את החברה אשר שלחה אותי למעון זה, ולהשכין שלום צודק בינינו ועם שכנינו. מי ייתן ותמיד אזכור שאני שליחת ציבור, ועליי להקפיד על ניקיון כפיים ולב. מי ייתן ואצליח ונצליח בכל מעשי ידינו. תודה רבה.
אמן. תודה לחברת הכנסת רות קלדרון. אני מאחל לך הרבה הצלחה בעבודתך בכנסת, בכל אשר תפני תשכילי ותצליחי. אמן.
Study text. Most Israelis do not affiliate with a denomination. 56% do not. 26.5% affiliate Orthodox. Around 7% affiliate with either Masorti Judaism, which is the conservative movement in Israel, or Reform Judaism. 9.7% don't know. Okay, so traditional Israelis make up 19% of the population, in which 7% of Jewish Israelis are either Masorti or Reform. We're going to look at the Masorti movement right now. In the middle, you see my friend Rabbi Diana Vila, who is a Masorti rabbi and has a lovely shul in French Hill, down the hill from the Hebrew University. And she loves the phrase lahagdil Torah ulaha'adira, which means to enlarge the Torah and beautify it. It's a phrase from the Talmud. And that's how she regards her work as a Masorti rabbi, to enlarge and beautify Torah by making halacha accessible to all Israelis, whether they're religious or secular, whether they're accepted by orthodoxy or not, whether they're gay or straight, male or female. Halacha, she points out, means literally to move, lalechet, to go. And halacha has to progress. And that's an important value that underlies how Masorti Judaism understands halacha. And when it comes to actual paid-up members, the Masorti movement in Israel is very small. It has about 70,000 members, under 1% of the population. But 3.9% identify with it, and 8% say they're in sympathy with it. And this has a lot to do with the ways that it's outreached to secular traditional Israelis. And we'll see a little video from the Masorti movement that...
אני הגעתי לארץ בשנת 2003 עם שני ילדים, יש לי 3 ילדים, בת 23, בן 16 ואנסטסיה שנולדה פה. אז הילדים הגדולים הם צריכים להחליט לבד. ואנסטסיה היא זורמת, היא הסכימה, וגם כל הזמן היא הייתה שואלת שאמא, אני כאילו נולדתי בארץ, וכולם אומרים שאני רוסייה, אבל אני לא רוסייה, אני נולדתי בארץ, אני סברית, אז מי אני? יהודייה, ישראלית, רוסייה, כל הזמן היה לה בלבול אז עכשיו אין לך.
אני מתרגשת להיות בעם הישראלי היהודי, זה כיף לי להתקבל אליו.
מאוד מרגש, פשוט חיכיתי לזה הרבה זמן.
צריך להגיד מזל טוב, ברוכה הבאה, אנחנו שמחים מאוד לקבל אותך כאחותינו. הגיעו כבר שהוא בהיריון ולקראת כבר ידענו שצריך לעבור תהליך של גיור, כיוון שהפונדקית היא לא יהודייה יהודית. דיברנו וביררנו מה אפשר לעשות. די מהר הבנו שדרך הרבנות זה יהיה כמעט בלתי אפשרי.
וכשנתקלנו בתנועה, ברעיון הזה של תנועה כזאת, ששוב, הוא לא זר, אנחנו, ביום כיפור שאנחנו צמים, אנחנו הולכים בסרט בכנסת מסורתי. זה לא משהו שהוא זר לנו. לגייר את הילדים בגיור מסורתי זה לא מובן מאליו, מחד. מאידך זה היה ברור שזה מסלול שהוא לגיטימי, רלוונטי ואפילו רצוי. אני חושב שהילדים שלי היום, היהדות שוכנת בהם באופן אינרנטי, ולתהליך הגיור היה משהו מאוד חשוב בסטייט אוף מיינד.
I'm very pleased that those who undergo conversion with us here in Israel are recognized by the state and registered in the Interior Ministry as Jewish. And that means if a woman converts with us, all subsequent generations will also be recognized as Jewish. This doesn't obligate the official chief rabbinate, so those people, those individuals are not able to marry through the rabbinate. However, the rabbis of the Masorti movement are more than happy to do the chuppah.
Shavuot is a holiday when we think particularly about conversion because Ruth, about whom we read on Shavuot, is the paradigm of the convert. She chooses to be part of the Jewish people and she chooses the Jewish spiritual tradition and so on. Both of those are really significant and it's what we're looking for in the people we see in our Beit Din as well. Sometimes their motivation is more spiritual, sometimes it's more a sense of belonging, but we look to see that people understand that they're making a commitment at both levels and generally that's what we find, that people really understand that they're taking on a new sense of belonging and they're also taking on a new way of viewing the world.
The rabbi that you just heard from, Rabbi Peretz Rodman, who I got to know a little bit when I was in Israel, is a close friend of Shoshana and Kajdan, Alav Shalom, for those of you in Ottawa who know them.
Yeah.
We're now going to move on, rightward, to religious Zionist Jewrailis. On one foot, being a religious Zionist, Dati Lumi, means that you believe that being a good Jew means observing halakha, beyond Shabbat and festivals, but observing the mitzvot and serving in the IDF. And on the upper right, you see the Tfilah L'Shlom HaMedina, the prayer for the state of Israel, which Adat Shalom and many shuls recite every week. And it is very much a religious Zionist prayer. They were the ones who wrote it back in the day when the chief rabbinate was religious Zionist. And its key phrase is Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu, the first flowering of our redemption. For religious Zionists, the state of Israel isn't just meant to be a home for Jewish culture, which is what many secular Jewrailis see as Israel's goal. The goal for the religious Zionists is that it's a place that's meant to realize the national and religious ideals of the Jewish people, including beginning the process of messianic redemption through rebuilding the country and settling it on both sides of the Green Line. On the upper left, you have another catchphrase for religious Zionists, Eretz Yisrael, Torah Yisrael, Am Yisrael, the land of Israel and the Torah of Israel and the state and the nation of Israel. That's their holy trinity, if you will. And the bottom is a very striking photo from the Gaza war in 2006 of someone davening on the battlefield. That says a lot about religious Zionists. They are deeply committed to the state of Israel. They are disproportionately represented in the high ranks of the IDF and in its elite units. They take military service as a kind of mitzvah, which it is considered to be in the Torah. And they also care very deeply about observing Judaism. Now, this all sounds good in some ways, but the community also has a lot of difficulties. It was really the first adapter of being a Jewreli, the idea that you could be both connected to Judaism and connected to the state of Israel. And they saw themselves as a bridge between the world of Torah and the world of the secular Jewish state. And they became role models for many Israelis and distinguished themselves in all parts of Israeli society. You know, they're also highly educated and tend to be highly motivated community. But the difficulty with a bridge is that you can cross over. The community today has a 50% attrition rate. They remain stable due to their high birth rate. But a lot of Jewrelis, now that Israeli society has become more Jewish, have chosen not to remain strictly observant religious Zionists, but to be fairly observant traditionalists or even secular traditionalists. At the bottom, we see srugim, the distinctive religious Zionist circular-shaped kippah. It's the kind of kippah I often wear, with a mosaic pattern around the edges. That also symbolizes something about religious Zionism. The kippot are much smaller than the big black velvet kippot that ultra-orthodox Jews wear. They're casual, they're colorful, they're not particularly obtrusive, but they mark you as a religious Jew. And similarly, religious Zionists, although they are very committed to halakha, those who remain in the community, are also very in touch with modernity and with modern trends, and they have a certain relaxed way to their Jewishness that is far more relaxed than you would see in the modern Orthodox community in North America. Now on to liberal religious Jewrelis. This was the community that I was proud to be part of when I was studying in Israel, that I was proud to be ordained from rabbis from that community, and I still feel very connected to it. And if liberal religious Jewrelis had a motto, it would probably be Hayashan Yitchadesh, V'Hahadash Yitkadesh. The old shall be renewed, the new shall be made holy. The words of Rav Kook, the first chief rabbi of the Yeshuv, the pre-state community. And liberal religious Israelis have a similar goal to Masorti Jews in that they want to make Judaism as inclusive as possible, as inclusive of different kinds of Jews, of both genders, of sexual orientations, and inclusive of all sorts of ideas that can enhance Torah, ideas from the secular world, like feminism, like individual self-determination, and on and on. But they differ in their approach to Masorti, in that Masorti believes in reformulating halakha in light of certain ethics that they believe are central to Judaism. Whereas the liberal religious Jewrelis are more focused on working within the halachic system, but trying to use the full range of possibilities. So on the bottom right-hand side, you see a partnership minyan, Shira Chadasha. A partnership minyan is different from an egalitarian minyan in that there's a mechitza, but like with an egalitarian minyan, the goal is to have participation from both genders. So they explored what parts of the service women could lead and found that women could chant haftarot, could be involved with the Psukei de Zimra, with giving divrei Torah, etc. On the left, you see two of the first women to be ordained as Orthodox rabbis in Israel. Rabbi Mishhammer Kasoy, who taught my wife Francesca at the Pardes Institute, and Rabbi Rachel Berkowitz on the left. On top, you see a liberal religious delegation at the annual Gay Pride Parade in Jerusalem. LGBT inclusion has been a very important topic in that community and in religious Zionism. And this religious Israeli is holding a sign that says, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. One of my great inspirations when it comes to liberal religious Zionism is my friend Dror Bondi. He grew up in the religious Zionist world on a settlement in Samaria, the West Bank, and began to become disillusioned with it. But he and the people he joined with took one of the core values of the settlement movement, Yeshivat Haaretz, or rather Kivush Haaretz, the conquest of the land, but they reformulated it. He joined the urban kibbutz movement, who decided that the kind of conquest of the land that was badly needed in Israel was not hilltops in the West Bank, but going into the inner cities, going into the most economically and socially depressed parts of Israel, and having religious and secular Israelis who have post-secondary training move in and work within the community as social workers, as daycare workers, as educators, etc., to help the people living there improve their communities. And on the upper right, you see Bet Yisrael, the community that he helped to found, which is one of my favorite places in Israel. If I'm ever zoche, if I'm ever fortunate to make Aliyah, I would love to live there. You see religious and secular Israelis, Sephardi, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, people of different economic backgrounds, all sitting together. And it really, I believe, encompasses Israeli Judaism at its best. It's a community that's based on expressing Jewish spirituality through caring. And Dror wrote, knowing God must open us up to caring absolutely for the other. I have a picture of Abraham Joshua Heschel on the right, both because Dror is the leading Israeli expert on Heschel and translated Heschel's work into Hebrew for the first time, and because Heschel's understanding of Judaism guides the community that Dror helped to found. It's a community that's deeply dedicated to social justice, and its Jewish spirituality drives that. It's an amazing place. Okay, now finally we get into the Haredi population. That is made up of Haredi Jews who are not associated with the state of Israel. They may cooperate with it, but they don't serve in its military. And national Haredi Jews who do serve in the military, but are otherwise ultra-orthodox. What those two communities have in common is the idea of Dat Torah. If you look at the middle pane, you'll see one of the countless leaflets that will get put up in the ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel with the latest Dat Torah, the latest edict of halacha. The idea of Das Torah, they pronounce it in the Ashkenazi way, is that in all decisions, great and small, you should rely on the guidance of leading rabbis. If you're Hasidic, a Hasidic Rebbe. If you're from the Lithuanian Orthodox tradition, a Rosh Yeshiva. And for national Haredi Jews, they serve in the army. They are Zionists, but they still follow Das Torah, which means their Zionism is problematic in that if a national Haredi soldier faces an order, let's say, to evacuate a settlement that Israel considers illegal, they will rely on the authority of their rabbi, who will sometimes tell them not to do it. So their loyalty to the state of Israel is problematic, even as they're Zionists. Rabbi Yeshua Pfeffer, one of the most eloquent spokespeople and interpreters of the Haredi community, writes, our Haredi community focused its nation building in the religious spiritual sphere through Torah observance and preserving the unique culture of Jewish community. These preserved our uniqueness, our Jewish identity through the generations. In other words, they believe that they do have a role to play in the state of Israel, but it's not through serving in the army or going into secular professions. It's through learning and preserving Torah. And you can disagree or agree with that. I personally disagree with that interpretation of Judaism. But I cannot help but admire how the Haredi community is asuk b'divrei Torah, is immersed in words of Torah. Even if they learn Torah in a very different way from me, even if I believe that they should not be receiving state subsidies to have 50% of their men learning in yeshivot every day, I admire how immersed in Torah they are and the kind of knowledge they can get from that education. Something that doesn't get talked about a lot in relation to the Haredi community is their very positive sense of achrayut, social responsibility and support. I think there's a fairly high level of achrayut throughout the Israeli population. Israelis really care for each other. They go beyond their immediate families and closest friends. Many Israelis care for their wider communities, for their extended families. But no community, Fuchs found, has more achrayut than the Haredi community. And here we see some illustrations of that. On the right is a gemach. A gemach is a center that will take used items. It could be clothes, it could be baby strollers, it could be kids' toys. And they're available for anyone who wants to come in, whether they're secular, whether they're religious. They have interest-free loan societies. They have societies to help people with transportation to hospital, and they are widely used by Israelis of all backgrounds. The same holds true for the ultra-orthodox community in New York, interestingly. In the middle, we see the Zakah in training. The Zakah is a group that has the terrible task of whenever there is, God forbid, a terrorist attack or a car crash, they go in and collect every last scrap of flesh to ensure that every Jew can have a dignified burial. And the ultra-Orthodox Jews are the only people who have the koach, who have the strength to do this. I think it all really comes down to their sense of chiyuv, their sense of being absolutely obligated to do the yashar v'hatov, to do the right and good thing. And on the left, we see a Haredi guy preparing food for a Haredi food bank. Again, they run an extensive network of food banks that are widely used both by secular and by religious Israelis. The Haredi contribution to Israeli society is really just beginning. They're really just beginning a process of integrating. In the picture here, you see what looks like a typical Haredi couple. The woman is wearing a shadel, and she's dressed very modestly with arm-length sleeves, and the man is is Hasidic and wearing a shtormel. But the wife in this picture is anything but typical. Meet Omar Yankelovich, the new Minister for Diaspora Affairs. She's the first Haredi woman to become a cabinet minister in Israel. Now, to be clear, she did not run for a Haredi party. Haredi parties do not allow women to run for the Knesset. She's part of Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party. But there are many women, including her, in the Haredi community who are advocating very strongly for women to be able to represent the Haredi community in the Knesset, for women to have access to higher education, for stronger support to fight domestic abuse and other issues. And there's a lot of change coming down the pipeline. Here, you see one of the new Haredi schools that teaches both secular and vocational studies alongside having a deep emphasis to Torah. Many yeshivot get away barely teaching a secular curriculum. You can graduate without knowing math or history or English. But there is change coming. There is a sizable minority of Haredi families who want their kids to be able to have a profession. to not have to live off of state funds. And there's a lot of change coming in that way also.
מדרשה החסידית שבו מחיקים לומדים גם לימודי קודש, אבל גם את מקצועות החול. אנגלית, מתמטיקה, אזרחות, היסטוריה.
כבר בגיל 14-15 שאלתי את עצמי שאלות, אבל אני חושב שנקודת הזמן הדרמטית הייתה כשהתחתנתי והחלטתי לצאת לעבוד. קיבלתי הצעה לשמש כמדריך פנימייה, ושם התחלתי בעצם את המסע החינוכי שלי, שזה אף פעם לא נגמר וכנראה לא ייגמר. ואז גיליתי, אני לא יודע כלום. אני לא יודע להתמודד עם משוואות, אני לא יודע להתמודד עם טקסטים מורכבים, אני לא יודע אפילו לא היסטוריה מינימלית.
הוא יצא ללימודים אקדמיים, ואחרי תואר ראשון בחינוך ותואר שני במדיניות ציבורית, הוא הקים את המכינה האקדמית לחרדים באוניברסיטה העברית. אבל שם הוא גילה שהסטודנטים מתקשים להשלים פערים.
לא אשכח כמה חבר'ה באו אליי ואמרו לי, אני לא יכול. כל הדברים הללו אפשרו לי להבין שחייבים פה לנקוט בצד אחד נוסף. וזה להקים ישיבה שאנחנו מחנכים ילדים ליראת שמיים. מחנכים אותם לאהבת תורה, אבל מכינים אותם לחיי מעשה. חשוב לי מאוד שישמור על הזהות, שיהיו אנשים ששומרים על הערכים שלהם, על הנורמות, זה מאוד מאוד חשוב. ומצד שני, אתה רוצה אותם כרופאים, כעורכי דינים, כמהנדסים. אני רוצה לראות אותם משתלבים בשירות הציבורי.
נפתלי, מה אתה רוצה להיות שתהיה גדול?
שאלה הכי קשה. אני רוצה לעסוק יותר בתחומי המדע.
מה בתחומי המדע?
אני לא יודע בדיוק לאיזה כיוון ללכת. אבל זה מושך אותי. בעיקר מושך אותי תחום הכימיה.
היום עוד 10 שנים, מה החלום שלך?
אני אישית, אני די אוהב מחשבים, ואני גם חושב שאני אצא, זה גם פרנסה, וזה גם מקצוע שאני די אוהב, אז לא אכפת להיות איזה איש הייטק. לא אכפת לי, אני רוצה.
Haredim will not necessarily be Zionists in the future. It's very important to them that if there's a Jewish state, it be governed according to Torah law, whatever that means. But they do want to integrate and participate. And as they enter the professions, I believe that they will more and more. And I believe that that will be a gift to the state of Israel because they have many positive values to share. They have their love of Torah, their deep love of family, and their love of chesed, of loving kindness. And that's something they can bring to the Israeli table. So, Besofa Devar, in the end of the matter, is Israel becoming more dati, more secular, or is it becoming, becoming more dati, more religious, or is it becoming more chiloni, more secular? And the answer is gam v'gam. It's a both and. On the one hand, we see that secular ideas are proliferating all parts of Israeli society to one extent or another. Ideas like feminism, ideas like liberal individualism, consumerism, human rights are all making themselves felt in one way or another. But at the same time, we see that the country is developing a stronger and stronger attachment to tradition. So people who, on the left, who believe that Israel is gradually becoming a theocracy are not right. The data does not bear that out. The Haredim are only 10% of the population, as we saw, or 17% if you include national religious Haredim. And the Haredim who fear that Israel is careening towards becoming a very secular society are also wrong. The battle for pluralism is unfolding in the streets. Not in the chief rabbinate. We see the chief rabbinate on the upper left, the two current chief rabbis, Rabbi Lau and Rabbi Yosef, who are both sons of former chief rabbis. They are Hardalim, they are Haredi Zionists who take a very stringent approach to Jewish law. This has led to misery for hundreds of thousands of people whose Jewish status is in question because they converted outside of Israel or because the bureaucracy questions their Jewish status. The chief rabbinate has absolute control over marriage, divorce, conversion, and burial. At the bottom, you see a group of Haredi schoolgirls who are trying to rush a service of the Nashot HaKotel, the women of the wall. So on one hand, when it comes to pluralism, things look very grim. But there's also another reality that we see here. On the streets, Israelis are praying with their legs, are voting with their feet, and creating a new reality that the chief rabbinate cannot stop. If you go to any sizable Israeli city on a Friday night, you will have your pick of minyanim to choose from. Secular Israeli minyanim, conservative or reform egalitarian minyanim, liberal Orthodox minyanim, as well as more classically Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox choices. The two institutions whose logos you see on top, Bet Morasha and Ein Prat, are gap year programs. Israelis will take a gap year after they finish their army service. These are places where Jewish Israelis from all parts of the spectrum, except maybe the ultra-Orthodox, get together to study Jewish texts, to see how Judaism can be related to living in a 21st century Jewish democracy. And the yeshiva of Ein Prat, where Dror Bundy teaches, is a similar place. At the bottom is a poster from an Orthodox gay-straight alliance group. And it's about Lama Ani Tzoed, why I'm marching, why I as an Orthodox Jew am marching in the Gay Pride March. A leading Israeli jurist, Ruth Gavison, and a leading religious Zionist rabbi, Yaakov Meidan, worked out a new covenant for observant Jews and secular Jews. If you want to see a vision for how the chief rabbinate could be reformed and how religious and secular Jews could get along better in Israel, I encourage you to read it. It's available online in English. So before we close, I want to ask, what does 21st century diaspora Zionism mean? Are we all still in the same boat? Does Israel really need us? One thing we have to be aware of is that Israel has a plurality of world Jewry and will soon have a majority for the first time in 2 millennia. Israel has a very high population growth rate. The diaspora is declining fairly rapidly due to assimilation. And within the next 10 years or so, Israel will have the majority of Jews in the world for the first time in 2,000 years. So if the 20th century was really the century of North American Jews, the 21st century will definitely be the Israeli century. What does that mean for us? Well, for one thing, it means that Israel is already the leading source of Jewishness in the world. If you love Judaism, a lot of the Jewish content that you're going to be inspired by and enjoy is available out of Israel. On the right, you see a rack of Israeli CDs. You can tell it's a little bit dated because nobody in Israel listens to CDs anymore. It's all streaming audio now. But you get the idea. There's been a renaissance of creativity in the Jewreli world in the last 20 years. Too many amazing music albums to count, movies, plays, poetry, all engaging with Judaism in a 21st century context. In the middle and left, you see the 929 movement. This was a movement started in Israel to study a chapter of Tanakh, of the Jewish Bible, every day. There are 929 chapters. And there are apps, and there's a website which has commentary from Jews left to right. And with just 15 minutes a day, you can engage with a chapter of Tanakh and grow so much in the course of a year. This started in Israel, but American Jews who were spending time in Israel got so excited by this, got so excited by how whole communities were coming together to learn Tanakh for half an hour a day, that they brought it back to North America. And now the material is available for free in English. You just Google 929 Tanakh. And many people in North America are having a wonderful time learning it. That's just one example of the great spiritual resources that Israel can offer us. I really believe that 21st century Zionism for diaspora Jews is about being part of the Jewish conversation, about what it means to be a Jew living in 21st century modernity. Something that Canadian and Israeli Jews have in common is that they care a great deal about Judaism. I pulled the graph on the left from the 2018 survey of Canadian Jews by Robert Grimm. 81% of Canadian Jews see Judaism as important or somewhat important to them. That's close to the 87% of Israeli Jews who see Judaism as important or very important. But we also have many differences. We see each other through the lenses of our fundamentally different societies. I could give a whole webinar on this. I'm just going to mention it briefly. Canada is a multicultural liberal democracy. Society is organized around the individual and the individual's rights and freedoms. That's a very valid model. Israel is a democratic nation state. That's also a valid model. Society is organized around the survival and the flourishing of the Jewish nation, which by no means indicates that non-Jews do not have rights in Israel, but it means that the number one priority is the Jewish nation. Just as Sweden is the national home of the Swedes and serves to protect and promote Swedish culture and the Swedish language, or Spain is the home of the Spaniards in the Spanish language. We have many differences. North American Jews tend to be outward looking. We want to understand how Judaism can relate to the non-Jewish majority society. And Israeli Jews tend to be inward looking. They're focusing on how Judaism can help them relate to other Jews. North American Jews are into universalism. What can Judaism mean in the big picture in terms of tikkun olam and humanity? Israeli Jews are into achrayut, social responsibility. How can it help us be a better nation? And the last point is that Israel has an established religion. It has an Orthodox chief rabbinate. Even if there's pluralism in the streets, there's still a lot of work to be done to make Judaism a free market in Israel. And we've already done that in North America, and it's been very good for Judaism. You can join whatever movement you want, and it's a wonderful free-for-all. So we have a lot to teach each other. We each have valid viewpoints, and it's not about converting Israelis into being North American liberals, but it's about listening to each other without judging and growing. Both the North American Jewish community and Israel are young countries that are still in formation, that are still thinking about how to do Judaism in the 21st century. So there's a lot that we can and must gain from engaging with each other. And I just want to make a brief plug for the Hebrew language. The North American diaspora is the first major Jewish community in Jewish history that does not speak a Jewish language. We speak English. And that has a major impact on our identity. The soul of a people is bound up with its language, its energy, its unique ways of expressing itself. Canadian Jews, as you see from the figure in the middle, do fairly well when it comes to Hebrew. 52% have some ability to read. And of that, 40% of Canadian Jews can carry on a conversation. That's not bad. But for those who aren't in that 40% and don't have the fluency, I really encourage people to work on their Hebrew. It may sound like a tall order, but it has never been easier with all the apps that are available like Rosetta Stone and Duolingo. If you just spend 20 minutes a day boning up on your Hebrew, you can make a ton of progress in a year. I really believe that it's rewarding and that it can deepen our connection to Israel, deepen our connection to Torah, and make us more vital Jews. The poster on the left says, Ha'ivrit Gesher L'chaim B'Yisrael. Hebrew is the bridge to life in Israel. And we see on the right that Canadian Jews do fairly well with traveling to Israel, 5.1 times on average. And there is nothing like being there, and especially going off the tourist path and meeting real Israelis, which is what I'm going to get to lastly. I think it's so important as 21st century diaspora Zionists to find our own Jewish Zionist affinity groups. Zionism is no longer about a national consensus in Israel, and there doesn't have to be a national consensus in the diaspora. Diversity is a good thing. Your Zionism doesn't have to be just about supporting the Israeli government. You may disagree with the current Israeli government. That's fine. And it doesn't have to be about following all the ups and downs in Israeli politics. What I think can be so life-affirming for diaspora Zionism is to find affinity groups. Find groups in Israel that you can carry on the Jewish conversation with, whether that be the Masorti movement or other movements that are involved with the renewal of Judaism in Israel. I personally love the Hartman Institute, which has an active presence in Israel, which was really the earliest adapter of all of these programs that attempt to bring together secular and religious Israelis, Jews from Israel in the diaspora, to talk about what it means to be Jewish in the 21st century. They have a hub in Montreal and another one in Toronto, and when there isn't a pandemic, they carry out regular programming, online and in person, that you can be part of. I bet you could also get some of their speakers to come to Ottawa. And they're carrying on a very rich Jewish conversation. So in closing, I believe that Jews in Canada and in Israel have a tremendous amount to learn from each other. We have to be ready, as we did with this presentation, to be dan l'chaf zchut, to give each other the benefit of the doubt, to not try to convince each other, but to listen, to learn, to share perspectives rather than argue. And the process of Jewish renewal in Israel is really just beginning. And in many ways, it's also just begun in North America. So we have so much growing to do. And my prayer is that we'll be able to learn and grow together. And all the rest is commentary. Thank you. And now we will have some time for questions. You can all still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, great. So what I would ask folks to do is, if you have a question, I can see all of your windows. Please either unmute yourself and you can turn on your camera if you like. It would be good to see people. And please ask away.
Lionel, unmute.
Yeah, you have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. I mean, central to the idea of Zionism is having a Jewish state. So I'm just wondering, like, if the people in Israel who consider themselves Zionists, I mean, what is their actual definition of a Jewish state in terms of demographics? I mean, what % of the population has to be Jewish? Like, I'm just comparing it to, say, Canada, where 21% of the population is Francophone, and that's about the same as the Muslim population of Israel. And then in Israel, you also have, like, Haredim who are actively hostile to, say, at least some of them. So, I mean, what in their minds is the definition of a Jewish state in terms of demographics?
You're saying for people who are secular, or you're saying for the whole country?
Whatever. I mean, whatever their definition, people who consider themselves to be Zionists. I'm just wondering, you know, I mean, I think underlying to this, you have to have some notion of just what percentage of the people actually have to be Jewish. I mean, like from a halakhic point of view, I mean, it's important to live in Israel. Like there's a mitzvah of like Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, like even though the country could be controlled by non-Jews, it's still a mitzvah to live in Israel.
Right.
But then there's like what you refer to as kibbutz haaretz, or like setting up a Jewish state. And like that's
Right.
where there's more controversy between the Hared, a lot of the Haredim, like the anti-Zionist ones who feel that that has to wait for the Messiah. But I mean, you know, even if you don't try to actively like conquer the state, like using military force, I mean, just to have a Jewish state, I mean, like, what does that mean? You know.
So I think I get your question. So that's a very good question, and I don't know that any study has been done that could put an actual number on it. We didn't have a chance to get into non-Jewish citizens of the state of Israel today, but one thing that I can share was that even though Israelis have the blessing of not having to worry about the Jewish future, about will my kids be Jewish, as so many diaspora Jews do, there were Israeli demographers who were deeply worried until fairly recently that Jews would one day no longer be a majority in the Jewish state. And I'm not going to go into all the data now, but there's a consensus developing that Israeli Jews have such a high birth rate now, in fact, the highest birth rate of any developed country, 3.4, as opposed to the average of 1.6 for developed countries, and that Jews will remain a majority far, far into the foreseeable future. But in the halakha and in the minds of many contemporary Israelis, we definitely find a belief in the need to maintain the rights of ger toshavim, of non-Jews who reside in our midst. And that is something, to be frank, that I believe diaspora Jews can help Israeli Jews understand better. It's not that non-Jewish citizens of Israel don't have rights. The Supreme Court, for one, has been extremely active in making sure that their rights are enshrined in law. But for a lot of Israelis, they're very inward focused on the Jewish community. They don't care enough about non-Jewish citizens of the state and ensuring that Arab Israelis have proper, social services, etc. And as Jews who have always lived as a minority in North America, there's a lot that we can teach them about being what it's like to be a minority and how important it is to care about the well-being of minorities. I think that is a Jewish value that can make Israel a more Jewish state. Okay, next question, please? Yes, David. Unmute yourself, please.
David, your phone isn't unmuted.
Okay.
I can hear you.
Okay. The last significant Oriental Jewish immigration was before 1965. Mm-hmm. And the Russian immigration is mostly about 20 years back. So the Oriental Jewish population, you're now entered into the third generation born or raised in Israel. And in Russian the Russians well into the first. I wondered if you can see changes in their relationship to Judaism in Israel.
Oh, that's a fascinating question. I would love to see data about that. What I have learned so far is that there is a slow but noticeable move towards traditionalism. The problem with the Russian Olim is that they were starting from nothing. They had been socialized in a socialist, atheistic state where they had no Jewish education, no exposure to Judaism, very strong exposure to secular Soviet nationalism. So their primary identification with Israel is as secular nationalism. They are disproportionately represented among the Israelis, the completely secular Israelis. But some of the second generation have been making inroads into traditionalism. But what I've heard from Russian Olim who I've met is that this is going to be a slow process that will take many generations. Many Russian Olim, believe it or not, have still kept baggage about religion and are still very strong atheists.
But what about the third and a half generation of the Oriental Jews?
What about them?
I mean, do you see a movement away from the kind of picture you had that you were giving about the Oriental Jewish culture?
So that's also a very interesting question. What we see, so we talked about how within the Jew-Israeli group, you have secular traditionalists, and then you have traditionalists, and onward. Now, the traditionalist part of the Jew-Israeli world used to be much larger. There are, as a general rule, people, whether Sephardi or Ashkenazi, who grew up in traditionalist homes that kept the Shabbat, let's say, fairly halachically, are more likely to have become secular traditionalists, people who are still connected to Judaism, but they don't say brachot, they don't daven every day, but they do enjoy Shabbat and Chagim in their own way. So in that subsection of Israeli Judaism, there has been a decline in halakhic observance, particularly in the Sephardi community. But these people continue to love Judaism and strongly identify with it in their own way. Okay, next question, please.
We're going to have to finish pretty soon.
All right, we have time for one or two more?
One or two more.
Okay.
Jason, did you have a question? No?
Oh, please unmute yourself.
No, I don't have a question, but I have to leave, and I just want to thank you very much. It was very, very good.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions. So let me just say, Toda Rabba, Hashir Haya Ma'anyen, Mitsuyan, V'Shavua Haba, Yeh Od Echad, Muzika Yisraeli. Toda Rabba, thank you very much.
Translate next week, same time, different Zoom link. I'll be giving a presentation about how Israelis relate to Judaism through music. There's been a renaissance of Jewish spiritual music in the last 20 years. It's a lot of fun and very uplifting to listen to. So if you have the time, next Sunday at 10:30, I hope you will join us again.
Thank you for an excellent lesson today. It was fascinating.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Actually, I have my hand up, but nobody's noticing me. Can I say something for a minute?
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you very much, Ari. That was, I mean, I would come to anything that you would present because, well, you're just so like, you know, the way in which you put it together, the whole thing is fantastic. And having seen you grow up as my children, so it makes my heart flutter to some degree. I also wanted to know if I see a lot of Musar in some of the changes. You know, I'm studying Musar and I see like the whole idea of, you know, going out to people and being with people and, you know, even the different sects. So that was interesting to me. I wonder, do you do a Torah study at all in the mornings, Saturday mornings anywhere that we could link into?
Thank you. Well, my own practice is not to use Zoom on Shabbat.
Right.
But not yet. We're still settling into Washington, D.C. And as far as Musar goes, yeah, Musar, you know, the movement of Jewish ethics and character development, and Chassidut have made a real comeback, particularly in the religious Zionist world. You'll see a fair number of religious Zionists and liberal religious Zionists who are living modern lives, but are deeply informed in their everyday lives by Musar and or Chassidut. And that's been a fairly recent development. I mentioned how my friend had translated Abraham Joshua Heschel's writing, who's you know, a modern Hasidic thinker. And Heschel is one of the greatest Jewish thinkers when it comes to North American Jewry. He was unheard of in Israel until 20 years ago, until this whole revival of interest in Chassidut and Musar began. And it's very exciting to see. You walk into a secular bookstore in the heart of Tel Aviv, frequented by secular Israelis, and you will find huge numbers of popular texts on Chassidut and Musar and many other aspects of Judaism that are sitting on the table for people to buy and read on their commutes. And there's new stuff coming out every month.
Thank you.
Ari. It's time to say bye for now. See
All
you
right.
next
Thank
Sunday.
Yitrod, everyone.
Have a wonderful week. Shavua Tov, everybody.
Shavua Tov.
Thank you.